Hey guys, welcome back. We are finally doing a Treefern soil video. This is by far the video that I get the most requests to do. This is the most questions I get on Instagram. And I don't even know that it'll be information I haven't spoken about before throughout all my videos, but it's probably easier for it to live under one umbrella. If someone hears me talk about it in one video, they can reference this video. But whenever I refer to Treefern soil, I basically just mean Treefern fiber mixed with a classic chunky aeroid mix. I've always loved growing in soil. I just like playing with dirt basically. And in the last, I want to say 2 to 3 years, I've grown to really love Treefern fiber, and I've loved them separately. But one day I was just like, let's put them together. And I loved that even more than the two parts separately. So it's become, in the last year, I've been using Treefern soil for about like a year and a half or so, coming up to 2 years. And I didn't use it quite as heavily when I first started it, but in the last, I want to say probably like 9 months, it's definitely become my go-to substrate. It's not the only substrate I use, but it's probably my most preferred, especially when it comes to anthuriums and anything I want to really grow fast. And over the last year, I've been using it on pretty much every genus of houseplant that I own, and I haven't come across one genus that doesn't respond well to Treefern soil. So I want to show you different genera plants I have growing in this substrate, how I'm potting it, how I'm watering it. I will also be showing you kind of a mix. I don't have actually it mixed right now. I've used it all up. I was doing like a crazy amount of potting in the last week, so I will be inserting footage of me mixing up the mix and the components that I'm adding, kind of the rough ratios that I'm adding. I didn't want to give you a strict recipe because I don't go by a strict recipe. I never go by measurements. I never go by ratios. I just add until it feels right, but I will attempt to give you somewhat of a ratio, I guess. I'm definitely not the first person to be using this mix. It's not something I came up with, but I also didn't follow anyone else's recipe or instructions when I first started using the mix. So in the last 2 years, I've definitely come across like things that didn't work, things that did work, and certain mixes that worked better than others. So when I was preparing to do this video, I really wasn't sure how I was going to structure this because I wasn't sure what I could bring to the conversation essentially. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm not an expert by any means, but I have used quite a few variations on this substrate over the last like year and a half. So I figured what I would do is kind of talk more in depth about what has worked, what hasn't worked, why I use certain components, why I don't use certain components, and hopefully that would be more useful to some people because I really don't think that substrates are one size fits all. It really depends on people's environments, their watering habits, their lighting conditions. So that's part of the reason why I didn't want to do a strict recipe in the first place. So I'm pretty sure the vast majority of the people who have requested this video have asked to see just my mix, and that's what you're here for. So let's just get that out of the way. So I'll give you a brief list of the components, and I'm going to go into each of the components and why I add them and how much I add it and for what purpose. So the first one is obviously Treefern Fiber. So Fernwood is the brand that I use, is the brand that I can recommend. It comes from New Zealand. I do think it's the best tree fern you can get on the market. New Zealand is really well known for being very strict on protecting its natural resources. So there's tons of regulations in place on how you can harvest, how much you can harvest, how often you can harvest. So I will link Fernwood's webpage in the description that kind of talks about how they process and create this product. I know there are companies that will take the Fernwood product and then mill it down to like a more uniform size, because one kind of downfall, I guess, of Treefern fiber, especially just like the bags that you can get from Fernwood, is that it's not uniform. So you'll get like these big twigs and you'll have like fines all mixed into there. There'll be like big matted clumps of it that you have to break apart by hand. So in using it, you do have to spend some time breaking it apart. And some companies, I'm not even gonna name one because I don't even know that's for sure Fernwood, but some companies will mill it down to a uniform size and then sell it that way just to kind of make it more convenient for people. But personally, I don't find it that difficult to just break it apart. Just know that when you get a bag of Fernwood, it's not gonna be totally like homogeneous, same size particles all throughout. You will have to spend some time to break it apart. But there's something magical about Treefern fiber and roots. Just roots want to find it. Like you'll see root growth like you've never seen before. One really nice thing about Treefern fiber is that like because they're just a series of twigs with some fines mixed through, there's always this matrix that allows airflow even without further amending it, even though I always further amend it because it is quite an expensive substrate. I want to be able to bulk it up with other things. And those little Treefern fiber twigs really stand up to reusing over and over and over again. And that's what I do. Like, I don't really see many instances where I cannot reuse it. At the end of this, I will go over like how I reuse the substrate, but it can be reused. It's a really like sturdy substrate, if that makes sense. But definitely the biggest pro of Treefern fiber is how much the plants love it and how fast the root growth is, how strong the roots become. And as a side note, this is really great for the anthurium hobby because Treefern fiber has become really popular because of the anthurium hobby. It's been around for ages in the orchid community, but it's had this resurgence of popularity because of anthuriums, and because it's quite an expensive substrate, people want to use it on their more expensive plants, which right now are anthuriums. So the fact that it encourages really strong root systems means that you can transition anthuriums outside of a high humidity enclosure a little bit quicker. I'm a firm believer that most anthuriums that we're growing in this hobby can grow in ambient conditions, dry conditions if you're in the northern hemisphere. And the stronger the root system is, the more efficiently it can take up moisture and the better it can grow in these dry conditions where it's not really like used to growing in. The last thing I want to say about Treefern fiber is that it's not the most water retentive substrate on its own. It really will depend on how much fines you have mixed in there versus like the really like twiggy parts of the Treefern fiber. But I will say on the whole, it's not the most water retentive. And that's not necessarily what you want in a lot of the houseplants we grow anyways, but it can get dry pretty fast. The really nice thing about it though is that it doesn't become hydrophobic the way that like sphagnum moss does. So it's easier to rehydrate, but it will dry out, but at a reasonable rate, in my opinion. So the next component is soil, and in my mix, it's about equal to how much Treefern fiber I use. So if it's 3 parts Treefern fiber, it's 3 parts soil. And I don't mean soil necessarily in like the composted earth sense of the word, but that's definitely, in my experience, the soil that has worked the best. And I used a soil that I'd gotten from a garden center. So I had bought this like big bag of like outdoor soil. It's like kind of earth. It's meant for container plants, but outdoors. And it was like a really big bag that I had purchased to bulk up like big tree plants that I was using to install into a cafe, one of my clients. So I wanted something cost effective, but still nutritious. So I just threw that into my Treefern soil mix and the plants went nuts. My anthuriums rooted so fast in that mix and they started growing faster and the leaves were sizing up bigger, and I was just blown away by the results. And that's what really solidified Treefern soil for me. And that's kind of when I started talking about it more heavily on this channel. So that was like the best version of this mix that I've ever used. The downside to using that is that you will get mushrooms. Like there's no kind of way around it. You will get mushrooms. That to me is not a con necessarily. I see way more mushrooms in the tent than I do out in my living room plants, but it does still happen. And they'll do the mushroom thing. So the mushroom is like the fruiting body, right? So it comes out of the soil, it opens up and then just releases a bunch of spores and it will get into all your other plants. So if that's a con to you, just something to consider. It's very mushroomy. The other thing you could use is coco coir. When I first started mixing my own soil mixes for my anthuriums, this was like 4 years ago, I was very heavy into coco coir, coco chunks, and it was like a soilless soil mix. And I look back at that time as like very underwhelming growth, just not very healthy plants, not very healthy roots. And I never really like thought about it too much after that. I kind of like scrapped that whole recipe, and then I was using like pond for a really long time. But revisiting that and kind of just doing a little bit more reading, I've always known that rinsing is important for coconut products because there's a lot of salts in there. And I've always used reptile products that is like very heavily rinsed for reptile enclosures and stuff like that, but it's not buffered. One thing I've heard about but never really read up on because I just didn't really feel the need to because I don't use that substrate is the need to buffer your coconut before using it, not just rinsing it. So buffering basically means that, from my limited understanding, means that you need to saturate the substrate with calcium and magnesium so that it doesn't just leach that from your plant, because it's more of a strong charge and the calcium and magnesium, the substrate, will be more attracted to the coconut than to the rest of the substrate or even to your plant's roots. So your plants end up looking a little bit sickly. At the very, very least, if you use coco coir, I would rinse it really, really well because those salts can wreak havoc on your plants. I don't think it will show up immediately, but it will show up over time and it can look pretty nasty. And I think if you are feeding heavily with CalMag over time, it will kind of even out and it will over time buffer your substrate. But that's just something to keep in mind. Coco coir can be pretty economical, but at the same time, you kind of get what you pay for. So if you go for the cheapest stuff, it probably will not even be rinsed and it definitely won't be buffered. If you get really nice stuff that's like marketed towards the cannabis market, you might get pre-buffered coco coir, but some people will still buffer it again themselves just to make sure that it is buffered. While I personally don't like coconut for my plants, I do know that it can be done really, really well. So one example that comes to mind is Tyler or Russo plants. He grows in a cocoa substrate. That's his chunky aroid mix, and his plants, if you've ever seen his accounts, they are like botanical garden size. They're huge. They're the size of a person. I've never known what his like process is and how he rinses or buffers. So that being said, I know it can be done. I just personally have had not great experience with coco coir. I just want to show you one example. So this is kind of like what I was going through at the beginning of my anthurium journey, usually with like bigger plants, but this is like a good example. So this plant is not a seedling. It is a cutting and it has been struggling for, I've had this for so long. Oh my gosh, I've had this since like last summer. So it's coming up to a year and I only just moved it out of coconut a couple weeks ago and it immediately started growing again. I haven't seen roots yet on the side of the pot. Oh no, I see one. It might be really hard for you to see, but there is a little fuzzy root tip right there. So this is a Pap Wonder Boy. It was in a cup with coco coir base kind of mix, soil mix, and it was a stump and I had put out a leaf. I think it was this leaf. And I had it domed and everything. It was under grow lights and then it put out basically in like 9 months, it put out 2 leaves. And it was just like the sickliest looking plant. And it was like, surely by now it should be a lot bigger. So when I started to suspect that it was the coco coir, I took it out of that mix and I put it into my mix and it started to grow again. And I think it will take some time to recover and start growing healthy leaves again. But when I took it out of that substrate, it had a root system. It was a cutting, right? So it had like the root system from the mother plant and the roots were fried. Like I don't have footage of it because it was just like one of those like, you know, evening repots off camera, but I took it out and it had all these roots were just, it looked like dry rot, but I know for a fact that that plant never ever dried out, but it also wasn't really taking up water in that time because I barely had to water it. So anyways, that is one example. This one's a little bit healthier. When I first got this is Anthurium Woohoo's First Night. This is also a cutting. It was in coco coir based mix and it had Treefern Fiber in it. So I was like, oh, Treefern soil, perfect. I don't have to do anything to it. But then it wasn't really growing. It was growing extremely slowly. So this was the first leaf in my care. So this is a cutting, so it should be maturing a lot faster than a seedling. I think this is the second leaf. It was a bit of an upsize. At the same time as that other one, that Pap Wonder Boy, I moved it out of the coir substrate and I moved it into my substrate. And the next leaf after that was a lot quicker and it immediately put out this leaf. So the growth rate started to increase and also the roots were looking way healthier. It basically didn't grow any roots in that old substrate, but it did grow it in this new substrate. So I definitely don't have enough experience with coco coir to say like how to make it work because I personally have not been able to make it work. That's why I don't use it. But if that's something similar to what you're experiencing with your problematic anthuriums, maybe that's something to look into. And the last commonly used option is peat, and that's what I'm currently working through. I'm working through a bag of the Pro Mix High Porosity Mycorrhizae mix. Once I finish up this bag, I will be going back to the compost-based soil because that has been by far the most like powerful of a Treefern soil mix. And not to mention, peat is banned in certain countries. It's definitely banned in the UK. I know that for being environmentally unfriendly. Canada, I believe, is the biggest producer of peat moss. And it's not really just the harvesting of the peat moss that's like not very, it takes hundreds and hundreds of years to produce in these bogs is not really just the harvesting, but the fact that peat bogs are a huge carbon sink. So they will just store all this carbon inside of these bogs. So when you harvest it, all this carbon is released back into the atmosphere. So a couple of ways you can avoid it. Either you use it so sparingly and you keep reusing it over and over again, or you can go the compost route, which is what I will be doing going forward. In looking back, the compost bag was just superior for me in my experience than anything else I've ever used as the soil component. I was getting an explosion of root growth and an explosion of leaf growth in the summer, which typically for me is not necessarily the time of the year when I grow anthuriums the biggest. They kind of slowed down a little bit during the really, really hot months, and I'm talking like July, August. But essentially the purpose of the soil component is to bulk up the tree fern, make it more water retentive. If you're using something with nutrition and like worm castings already in it, then it adds nutrition back into the substrate rather than just relying on adding fertilizers when you water or slowly release fertilizers, which then leads me to the next thing I add, which is worm castings. Worm castings, really straightforward, is about 1 part worm casting. So 3 parts, 3 parts, 1 part. And then I amend for aeration. So the first thing I add is perlite. The perlite I use is not like the finest grade. It's probably a grade 2 or a grade 3. Grade 4 is way too chunky for me. I don't like it. It's too porous. Grade 2 or 3 is like kind of the sweet spot, somewhere in between the two. Roughly about 1 part of that, 1 to 2 parts of perlite. And then I add fir bark. So I currently am using, or have been using for the past few years, Repti bark, which is 100% fir bark. I get it from my reptile supply store, and that is basically it. And I won't go in there and mix it usually by hand because I will manually be pulling apart Treefern fiber chunks, but this mix will require frequent mixing over time. Every time you use it, you're gonna have to mix it again because the perlite will float to the top and the Treefern fiber somehow, I don't know what they do, they just like gravitate towards each other. You'll have certain parts of your bin that are more heavy on the Treefern than others, so it's a lot of frequent mixing when you're using this mix to make sure everything is evenly distributed. I did get a question about what is like a must-have in the mix and what's not a must-have. I would say if you were to break it down to the bare minimum, you will need the Treefern fiber, you'll need the soil, and then you'll need something else to aerate it a little bit more. And that thing can be either one of perlite or bark. I prefer to use both. One thing I do not use, and I haven't used for years, is charcoal. I used to read about like a chunky earth mix, and charcoal chunks, like big chunks of charcoal, were always in the mix. And the purpose of it is, they say, to purify the soil and battle root rot. Charcoal will also absorb nutrients from the soil. So it's going to be leaching things that your plants could also get. It's not going to be like very selective about only absorbing like the bad things. It's also going to be absorbing the good things. So in my mind, I would end up under fertilizing my plants, and root rot generally is not really a huge issue for me. And the reason being, I think the last component of the soil mix that is so important is beneficial microbes in the form of mycorrhizal fungi and beneficial bacteria. I don't think I could do this hobby without myco. I feel like I owe a lot of what's successful about this mix to Great White. Essentially, that's the brand that I use. Great White has beneficial bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi and trichoderma. To me, I am trusting them with the health of my soil. I am also trusting them with like breaking down decay. For that reason, when I see root rot and stuff, I don't necessarily unpot the plant right away. A lot of the times the bacteria will be breaking down the rot. Let's say like I underwatered it and like the root tip shriveled up and it's dead. The bacteria will kind of break it down, but I will also be seeing healthy root growth in conjunction with some dead roots. So when that happens, I generally just monitor the plant. Is it declining? Has it stopped growing? Are leaves just not expanding properly? Is the root rot kind of taking over? It does happen, but it's not really a big problem. And before I forget, one last component that is not always present in my mix but has been present in the past is lechuzapon. The reason why sometimes lechuzapon will be in my soil mix is because I will have it mixed in with my bin of just Treefern fiber. I have a bin of Treefern fiber that I just mixed with perlite and lechuzapon for any plants that I have potted up in just that mix without any soil added. And the part of lechuzapon that I think can do what perlite can't do is the zeolite in Luchuzapon, which acts as like a pH buffer. Keeping in mind, I'm not an expert, but I know that zeolite can buffer the overall pH of the substrate. And I know it has a high cation exchange capacity, which can also buffer some of the nutrients, which means that it's harder to burn your plants. It's definitely not a make or break component of the substrate, but I do know that sometimes Luchuzapon will find its way into my mixes. Also, my general approach to substrate is it's not perfect. It's kind of sloppy, to be honest. My soil bin sometimes ends up being like a dumping ground for substrates that gets rinsed and reused. So even if I have a pond plant that gets like repotted into something else and I have all this pond that's rinsed, I don't feel like getting out my pond bin. I just throw it into my soil bin, which leads me to the reusing thing, which I got so many questions about. I reuse my soil until, I don't know, I'll just reuse and reuse and reuse and reuse. When I'm repotting, I'm always gathering up all of the soil that's like doesn't end up in the pot, and I'll just put it into a communal like bowl, and then I'll pick out all the dead roots. Sometimes I will sterilize it. Sometimes if there was nothing wrong with the plant, it wasn't like overtaken by root rot, and I don't think there's an unhealthy like pathogenic bacteria in there, I will just let it dry out and just dump it straight back into my soil bin. I've been doing this for so long and I don't see the issues with it. The only times I will sterilize it is when I had a really bad case of root rot, like all the roots were dead. It was not just dry rot, it was just like that wet, slimy, wet rot. Then I will take out all the roots and then I will sterilize it in the oven. The minimum temperature my oven will go is 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes I'll do that for 30 minutes. Sometimes I'll do 200 for 20 minutes. But basically you want to do it for longer if you have a lot of substrate. So, but if you have a really thin layer, you don't really have to do it for long. You just need to heat that up to a temperature that kills the bad bacteria. If you want to know exactly the temperature and the times, you can like quickly Google it. And then I just let that substrate dry out completely, and then I just dump it straight back into my bin. Sometimes you'll see me doing this in repots where I like unpot a plant and there's all this like substrate on my potting mat, and I'll just like scoop it up and reuse it for like the next plant if I don't think that there's a lot of pathogens in the soil. So one example is this red Crystal Aluxe, which I chopped in my last video, the vlog where I did a repot and chat with Charmaine, and we chopped this on camera. And I repotted it into the same soil it was in before. I just kind of like gathered it up and just repotted it back in. It wasn't really a rotty plant. I didn't really see any rot in the roots. It has been rooting happily in it for the last week, and it pushed this leaf out right after. I don't even think that leaf was like on its way out or poking out at the time. It just took off. There's this big healthy root right here. When you're sterilizing substrates in the oven, there's like a few cons. Obviously, it's gonna smell like soil in your oven for a little bit. Leave the door open, let it air out. Another con is that you can be killing beneficial microbes in the substrate. I mean, you will kill the beneficial microbes in your substrate. The heat will also break down the substrate quicker. My thinking is that my soil bin is kind of this perpetual soup, so I'm taking from it when I need it. I'm putting the reused stuff back in, and I'm adding more worm castings and stuff to reintroduce nutrients to the soil. And I, again, am relying really heavily on the microbes in Great White to reinvigorate the soil, make it more alive, and break things down to nutrients that are readily available to the plant. And also, if I fail to pick out any dead roots and stuff from the substrate, I just rely on the microbes to break that down. I'm not really that fussed with a bit of dead root here and there in my reused soil. I'm not really one to get down to like the very microscopic chemistry of like what's bonding to what and what needs to be added in what order and what's going to happen on a microscopic level. I'm relying heavily on the micro and the bacteria to do that work for me. So I know I spent a lot of time saying you can reuse the soil, but I really would encourage everyone to reuse all of their substrates, with the exception of maybe sphagnum moss, which breaks down pretty quickly and becomes acidic. Basically, everything I use can be reused over and over and over again. And I think we really underestimate how much we can end up spending on substrates. I used to joke that like whatever money I was making on YouTube, I was just like spending on substrates, which was true for the most part. Until I started reusing everything. And it really wasn't until Great White that I felt really confident in reusing without being detrimental to my plants. So I wrote down some pros and cons to the substrate. So the pros are obviously that The plants really love it. They grow really fast. I would say the rate of growth has increased and the size of the leaves have increased to the point where I'm kind of stressed out. I'm actually very stressed out with how big my plants are getting. Like you can see that it didn't used to be that full. Yesterday I was in here, I was rearranging plants and I was like taking plants out to like wipe things down and stuff, and they just wouldn't fit back in, which is good and bad. I didn't really regulate what I was putting into this mix, so things are getting bigger much faster than I was ever accustomed to plants growing. So it's good and it can be stressful. The Treefern soil, I think, in my opinion, is a better long-term substrate than just straight Treefern fiber. And it also costs less than using straight Treefern fiber. You can bulk it up with whatever you want, and you can add more perlite if you want. If that's your cheapest component, add more perlite, add more bark. I tend to make my mix less chunky than like the classic chunky aroid mix recipe because I don't like watering. I find it such a chore, but I have to do it. And I'm growing a lot of plants, mainly anthuriums, that really do not like to dry out completely. But like I said, everybody is different. It's trial and error. If it's drying out too fast for you, maybe make it less chunky. If you don't want to water it that often, make it less chunky. If you find that you're overwatering your plants, make it more chunky. This substrate for me, I don't think is the most water retentive substrate you can get. But I think that for the majority of what I'm growing and what a lot of people are growing, you don't want it to be that water retentive. So I end up having to water my plants, mainly my anthuriums, about once a week, my philodendron and Hoya every like 2 weeks. Those are plants that I think appreciate a bit of a dry cycle, not a dry cycle. Well, some of them do, but my anthuriums definitely don't appreciate that. So I do anthuriums about once a week and then everything else about once every 2 weeks. So generally my approach to buying substrates these days is I kind of go with the approach of like you spend more to save more, if that makes sense. Like sometimes you just get what you pay for and you can reuse it more often. Case in point, like sphagnum moss, like if you get that really nice, I don't use sphagnum moss, but if you get the really nice New Zealand sphagnum moss, it's like really long fibers, they hold up better. It's not contaminated with like sticks. Sometimes I've found like pieces of plastic in with the cheaper sphagnum moss, or like coco coir, like you're gonna spend more for something that is pre-rinsed. And you can get perlite really, really cheap, but the cheap stuff is like all different sorts of grades mixed together. So I really just go for, I get whatever I can afford that is the best quality and I just reuse it over and over and over again. One substrate though, this is not really related to this at all, but Fluvostratum, I think it would just turn into dust after like one potting. So that's not really a reusable substrate. Anyways, I feel like I've been filming forever and I've only just talked about the mix. So we're just gonna talk about the plants I'm growing in the mix. First, I feel like there were questions on imports and propagations. So I've been using Treefern soil for my propagations, which is kind of an expensive substrate for plants that you're gonna sell. A lot of people will just use like the cheapest thing they have for their propagations, like perlite or like a bit of sphagnum moss. But I just want it to root faster. It roots faster for me. I can like get it going faster, but also I want to send it to someone with like activated growth and like a healthy root system. It just makes me feel better about it. So this one is a Hoya Wilbur Graves China No ID, so not the Russian Wilbur Graves. This was potted, what day is it today? I potted this roughly 5 days ago. And we have healthy roots growing here. This was in water. It didn't even have that much roots, but this is doing really great. This is kind of why this is like my go-to propagation substrate now. This is 2 cuttings of Philodendron Rio, potted at the same time about 5 days ago. There's all the root growth there. People have been using Treefern Fiber for Hoyas for a while and they say it works really well. And here is some proof. This is the Hoya Nova Ghost and it was potted. There's pond at the bottom as like a reservoir layer, Treefern soil on top, and it has all these healthy roots and it's growing kind of like slowly, like a Hoya rate, but it is constantly growing. Here's another Hoya. This is 3 cuttings of Polyneuria, 1 regular Polyneuria, this one, and then 2 stems of the Broguette. So there's 3 plants in here, but the roots are really happy. This plant is like constantly underwatered. I water this at the same time as all my other Hoyas, but this one really doesn't like to dry out. So that said, it still seems really happy. I've chopped this probably like 2 or 3 times in the last 6 months, and it just keeps growing super fast. This one is in no drainage. This one has leca at the bottom. When it comes to using kind of a self-watering or hydroponic system for Treefern soil, I would normally keep a reservoir for my anthuriums or for my Hoyas. This is just so if I somewhat over water, like I put too much water into the pot, it has somewhere to go that's not just like waterlogging this part of the soil. Another non-anthurium that really likes Treefern soil is Ripsalis paradoxa. So Ripsalis don't like it as dry as like a desert plant. So I figured that no drainage would be good for it because I don't like to water my living room plants that often. So this is a setup that has been really happy with. There's good amount of roots in here and it's been growing pretty steadily. I would say I'm not like brilliant at growing Ripsalis, but previously when I was growing it in pond, I would every now and then get a plant within here that just rots right at the base. This hasn't happened since I put it into Treefern soil, which would have been roughly 6 months ago. I showed this one pretty recently, but Monstera, this is my Burley Marks Flame. It seems to really also like Treefern soil. It rooted so fast in this, and I underwater this. There's a little bit of dry rot in here. You can see right here, there's some dried out roots, but I have no plans on unpotting it to like snip off the dead roots. The bacteria will do its thing. It's been growing really constantly. The leaves aren't deteriorating. This one I was very, very happy about. This is my Drina reflexa. I said I was gonna show this plant in the Treefern soil video. I freaking love this plant. I got this plant last summer. I got it as like a huge tree and it was for one of my clients, but it was too big for their space. So I was like, well, I guess I'm gonna have to trim it a little bit. So I got a couple of cuttings and I gave one cutting to Charmaine, and I was having the hardest time rooting this. Everyone says Drina is so easy to root. I had never propagated Drina before this. So the first thing I did, I put it just in water. That was the general consensus, that they root so fast in water. It was starting to root. So when those like primordial roots started, I moved it over to leca, which also was another recommendation. That, I don't know what happened, but that leca stank so bad. There was some like rot. I don't know. It was really bad. It was not rooting. I had it in there for probably like 2 months, at least 2 months. So then as a last ditch effort, I was like, I don't want this stinking leca that smells like sewage. I put it into Treefern soil with barely any roots. So this spindly guy right here, this one, this little plant here, there was no roots on it, 0 roots. This one had the start of some roots. So I just plopped it into Treefern soil and lo and behold, freaking loves the substrate. Look at that big juicy root. And in the last couple of months, it's finally started to put out new growth. So it's growing here. It's also growing up here. You can also see that the spindly guy with no roots is starting to grow as well. I just love this plant so much, and it's just part of my living room, and I really don't show it very often because it's just kind of part of the living room. But if I got rid of like every decor-y type of plant, this would be the one I would fight to keep. This one's like kind of a recent repot. This one is my Anthurium X1 cross with X1, and this one was one of my boat mode turbo upsize pots. It was in a little deli cup, and I just put it in this huge cup, and it was like only these 2 leaves, and I was like, this looks ridiculous, but it just popped a new leaf almost immediately. And roots have reached the side of the pot now. Right now, this is my preferred potting setup for anthuriums, in a drainage pot, and then something, depending on the size of the pot, that is deep enough to sit in a little bit of water. I won't keep a reservoir in there at all times, but if there's roots escaping, I try to keep at least some moisture in there so those escape roots don't dry out and just become deflated. This is another fairly recent repot. This is my Carla Wu 1 self. I moved it from this pot into this pot. This is the biggest orchid pot that I have. The roots have really filled out the pot, and look at this new leaf. It's stunning. It's so beautiful. I love that it's getting rounder. I love that the veins are getting more prominent. It's only just gotten to the stage where it like turned velvety. You know how like velvet leaf anthuriums are kind of glossy when they come out and it turns velvety as it expands? It's only been velvety for like 2 days or so, so I think it still has quite a bit of expanding to do. But the really exciting thing is, do you see what I see? This is the first caterpillar leaf and it's flowering. You see a little pink spathe poking out of the petiole there? It's actually alarming how quickly this has grown. I've had this plant for like 6 months. It was a little seedling this size when I got it, and it's flowering now, which is equally to do with the strength of the plant. It was obviously a really healthy plant when I got it. And also I believe Treefern soil and constant upsizing of the pots. So I have a little bit of a reservoir in this one. The other day I just kind of slightly watered the saucer rather than watering the pot, because there is a little bit of an escape root at the bottom. A couple of months ago, I chopped up this plant, which is the Fort Sherman Ralph-linum. I was so nervous for it. I got 2 cuttings off of it. And this is a plant that me and Charmaine split, and this is joint custody. We're gonna breed with it. And I was nervous because it's not just my plant to prop. It had a lot of dead roots on it. I got it from my friend who had it potted in pure lechuza pond, but it got underwater, so there was some dry rot on it. And he told me that it had not done well in soil. It like rotted all its roots, and it was doing a lot better in pond, and it put out all this growth in pond. They were putting out leaves like this size. It's ugly right now, but it was like nicely upsizing and started flowering. So I was a little bit, oh, there's new offset on it. So I was pretty nervous that it wouldn't do well in substrate, because like he had said it didn't do well in soil, but I put it in Treefern soil. He hadn't tried Treefern soil before, and it has accepted the substrate with open arms. It seems it's put out this from an offset, which I will be separating at some point soon. That offset has put out a second leaf right here. I'm just waiting to see root growth coming out of that substrate, and I'll be separating it out. This is the first leaf from the top, the apical bud, and I just noticed that there's a new offset that's activated right here. So this is gonna be like a baby factory. I think this leaf has some expanding to do. It's not gonna expand way more, but I think that once these roots start to fill out the pot, it's gonna start sizing up a lot more dramatically. Another question I got is whether I use this substrate for imports. So this one is my newest import. It was not planned. I didn't order this. This one is a Bessier Ave. It's from Tropicals. I got it from NST. Lauren had ordered a bunch of Bessier Ave seedlings, and I just thought this one was way too cute. So I swiped it before it went on sale. This was not exactly the one I've been looking for, but I hadn't really pictured one like this. This one was just way too cute. Do you see how the lobes are kind of like curved in towards each other, and they're like short little stubby things, and the overall leaf is really round? And I noticed that every leaf is very consistent in that. This is the newest leaf, and the lobes, look at these stubby little things that are just pointing towards each other. I just thought it was way too cute, way too round to pass up. This one had a pretty good root system, and it went straight into Treefern soil. And I'm actually acclimating this in ambient conditions. I just got it right here, and it is seemingly happy as a clam. It's been in Canada for about a week, and I'm just keeping a little bit of a reservoir on here so it doesn't dry out. In my experience, Bessier Ave like really don't like drying out. They like to be a little bit more wetter. I treat it the way I would typically treat a Warocqueanum, which is a little bit more wet, and like my anthuriums are never dry, but these I keep a little bit wetter, if that makes sense. So I definitely think unless it has no roots at all, if it has what looks like healthy roots, I would use this mix for imports. And I'm speaking mainly about anthuriums for that, because anthuriums, in my experience, they're not huge root shedders after import, versus like Hoyas, philodendrons. You're pretty much rooting a lot of those from scratch. So for those ones, I would use something that's easier to like take apart and like rinse off, something that's less of a hassle to unpot and kind of sterilize again. I'm hoping I answered everyone's questions. I'm just gonna double check the questions really quickly. Oh, I forgot to talk about fungus gnats. I don't have a huge problem with fungus gnats. They are definitely present, and especially when I started using, like, transitioning a lot of stuff to soil, it was a lot worse than before when I was growing in pond primarily. But I know that it can be worse. It's not like when I water a plant and like fungus gnats just like come flying out of the pot. That typically doesn't happen. What I use for fungus gnats every now and then, I haven't used it in a while, is mosquito dung. So it's basically like a bacteria that attack the larvae in the soil, and it kind of stops the life cycle there. But I think the biggest thing that helps me with fungus gnats in general is the fact that my house is full of spiders. I am constantly cleaning cobwebs in this house, which is really annoying, but if it's gonna help me with mosquitoes and fungus gnats and stuff like that, they can live. I don't do anything to get rid of spiders. I just clean up their dirty cobwebs whenever they abandon their webs. But I do think that's one reason why I don't deal with like a fungus gnat like total infestation. So when it comes to fungus gnats eradication, I'm not the one to ask. I just let spiders do their thing and then kind of like deal with them flying up my nose every now and then. But fungus gnats is definitely going to be a thing. People were asking me about like springtails and like soil mites. I do see them every now and then, but it's not like when I lift up my pot, they're all just like swimming around in the reservoir. I don't really see springtails all that often. And springtails and soil mites are those things like you don't even know where they came from because they weren't present in the soil or the components when you got it. But all of a sudden, when you like pot the plant up and you start watering it, they just come out of nowhere. I will see them every now and then in my props, like in something in a dome or something. I'll see them crawling around over the chunks, but I don't really see them around my soil. Not that they're harmful in any way, but I just don't really see it. One question was like, does the myco always show up on the side of the pots? So the answer is no, but I thought it'd be interesting to answer this question. So I will see the Myal Networks. It looks like a web. I think I have a photo of it somewhere. It's in my RA5. I would show you, but the RA5 is like really nestled in there. The shelf is like holding up its infructescence. It has berries forming. I just don't want to touch it. But I have shown before like the actual visible micro network in there. There has been the argument made that synthetic fertilizers will kill mycorrhizal fungi in the substrates. And I've also read articles kind of not necessarily debunking it, but arguing against that. And I'm more of the side of the argument that says synthetic fertilizers aren't killing myco. And the reason being, first of all, I can see the myco on the side of the pots. I don't always see it, but it will show up in some of my pots. I did read another article that argued against the notion that synthetic fertilizers would be the culprit for killing mycorrhizal fungi. Synthetic fertilizer is just like those nutrients, right? So it's the NPK and other micronutrients. There's no reason that that would kill mycorrhizal fungi. The reason why the correlation was made in the first place that synthetic fertilizer would kill myco is that soil in commercial farming is typically devoid of beneficial microbes like mycorrhizal fungi, which is often present in a lot of wild soil. It's just like, it's kind of everywhere. So that article is arguing that it's not the synthetic fertilizer in commercial farming, it's the practice that of like excessive tilling and heavy machinery that's compacting the soil to place that's like not hospitable to mycorrhizal growth. So the notion that you shouldn't use synthetic fertilizers because it will kill the mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria in your soil, I just don't think that's true. Although that just reminded me that I use primarily TPS1 as my all-in-one fertilizer, and I will supplement with CalMag every now and then and some other things, but TPS1 is like my main one. And TPS1 does include beneficial bacteria, which is just like another great thing about TPS1. I just really like it. Amanda has told me in the past that TPS1, she accredits that to be what makes her anthuriums flower so often. And I mean, this room is full of anthurium flowers, so I believe it. While we're on the topic of myco, which is, I know that's not the topic of this video, but I get asked this very often, so I might as well answer it now, which is like, why do you only water it through the roots after repotting it rather than sprinkling it dry? Can you do it either way? The reason why I do that is because I think it will stretch the myco further, and it just becomes so habitual to me now that I never even think of sprinkling it dry on the roots. I do think that would be the most impactful. So whenever I'm really nervous about something, I will try to remember to sprinkle it dry on the roots. But the reason why I always water it through is just because I that's just what I gotten so used to doing. Question about Treefern Fiber. What do you do with the superfine particles in the bag? Do you just mix it in? Then the answer is yes, I just mix it in. I don't sift it out. The thing about Treefern Fiber, when it's dry, it's like super dusty. So I do recommend like wearing a face mask so you're not breathing it in. But with my Treefern bin, my bin of Treefern Fiber that's mixed with perlite and pond, I just keep that damp all the time so I'm not dealing with the dusty stuff, but I do not sift that out. I just never bothered to. Are molds in the substrate bad and how do I prevent it? So molds will grow in substrates when it's consistently damp, dare I say wet, like quite wet for prolonged periods of time. I don't really get mold in my substrates. The last time I remember getting mold was on anthurium seeds when I just planted them. But as the seeds germinate, the mold just kind of went away, and the only seeds that stayed moldy were the ones that were failed, like they never germinated. I can only think that the only reason why I don't get mold is because like mold is not a beneficial, like the mold, like the fuzzy mold that you see on soil sometimes, that's not the beneficial kind for your plant. I believe trichoderma is the beneficial mold that can actually interact with your roots. Actually, in saying that, I'm going to be linking a podcast that I have loved. I've mentioned it before, but it's called, I'm trying to remember what the episode was called. The economic something of mycorrhizal fungi, but it's by the Mushroom Revival podcast. It is just fascinating, like what's happening. No, it's called the economy. Anyways, it's about how it's almost like a bartering system between mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria and the plant roots. Studies that have shown of like what the nutrients are actually being traded between the two, and how it almost feels like these microbes are inflating value on certain nutrients. It's just fascinating. So I will link that. Not that that has anything to do with the question. I think that great white might be the reason why I don't get the fuzzy mold on top of my substrates. The vast majority of the questions I got from Instagram was like to do with how to reuse it, how often you can reuse it, how to sterilize it, how often to water, what the mix is. I feel like I've answered pretty much every question that I got. So hopefully this video is helpful. At the very least, it'll be something that I can reference every now and then whenever I get questions on this. You guys know I really struggle with these like how-to tutorial type of videos and like big informational videos. So I tried my best. If there's anything that anyone takes away from this video, I really hope that it's just that Treefern Fiber is great for roots. Substrates can be reused over and over and over again, and it's really worth the effort. It's not even really that much effort, especially when it's done in conjunction with beneficial microbes. And if anything, I just really hope that people start using myco and beneficial bacteria more often in their substrates, because I cannot imagine growing plants without them anymore. It's just the best. Anyways, I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you in the next one.